Hello, I'm Tara, that's Caitlin, we're in the 11th grade, and we will be performing what we like to call the Beatles and the British invasion of the 1960s, and how they crossed a social and cultural frontier, but explained in poor accents and horrible comedy by two 16-year-olds who weren't there.
And all in under 10 minutes. Alright, here we go. It all began in the 1950s. A band was formed around a pair of men who started performing together in 1957.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Adding a third member in 1958.
George Harrison.
The band went through several names.
The Quarrymen, the Silver Beatles.
And they eventually landed on the Beatles.
They performed in Liverpool and took trips to Hamburg to perform for drunk sailors. Then finally, in 1962, after firing their previous drummer, they added the final missing piece of the Beatles, Ringo Starr.
Now, we're trying to keep this summary rather brief, so we'll spare you the rest of their history and instead skip to when they came to America.
To give some historical context on what they were coming to, the American music scene was fading out of what the 50s were.
Big solo act rockers.
Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, to name a few big names.
So to see a British boy band come and take over was wild.
Now, they weren't completely unheard of. Their hit song, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, had just hit #1 in the US when they flew into JFK.
I wanna hold your hand.
Caitlin. Yeah. Like copyright again? No, like last time we sang in NHD?
Okay, anyway, back to the topic. On February 7th, 1964, rocking suits and bowl cuts in a cool way, the Beatles were in America.
They were welcomed by a herd of screaming fangirls.
Here's what we feel that looked like. Hello, we are the Beatles. The Beatles instantly became the biggest name in music of their generation.
Their first performance in America was a TV appearance on the national hit television show, The Ed Sullivan Show.
Roughly 40% of the American population was tuned in.
You could hear the screams of the teenage girls that filled the audience.
This signified the magnitude of the Beatles and their effects. They had 40% of the American population listening, even though their sound was muffled due to the screams.
That was just the beginning of it all. The Beatles kept growing and evolving. I feel we should touch on some of their impacts.
They changed music. They had new sounds in each record. They broke the big Elvis-type act mold of the 50s.
They used their music to introduce Eastern sounds to the West with their heavy influences from Indian culture and music.
They were also the first band to do big motion pictures and creative music videos that showcased their art.
This influenced many other musicians and caused a shift in how we consume music and how music is produced.
Beyond all their musical influences, they influenced the culture too.
They brought British culture into America along with other cultures.
They weren't the only bands to come to America. The Who.
Who?
The Who.
Who?
Alright, anyway, they would play their first American show in 1967.
Oh, you mean that Who? You know, Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey, may he rest in peace, Keith Moon, and at the time, Johnny Entwistle?
Took you that long. But yeah, they had an insane stage presence. They would smash their instruments. They had fire, they had smoke bombs, they had everything.
The Who and the Beatles were both so different, not only from each other, but also from the rock and roll acts that America had prior.
Both bands took heavy influence from said rock and roll acts, but they weren't the same.
They had crossed both a social and cultural frontier in history.
I mean, I guess that's a way of putting it, but how would you say they did that?
They did that in multiple ways, both how they were influenced by American rock and roll and culture.
They often covered American rock and roll songs and took heavy influence from the music of the 50s.
And also how they influenced and impacted American culture in the 60s.
They brought many different ideas and cultures to America.
They, or more specifically the Beatles, were often the soundtracks and, I guess, driving force of a very popular American 60s subculture.
Hippies.
I feel that we couldn't do this performance about this time period without touching upon this very important and to this day influential subculture.
They were often seen in different clothing that appeared wild in contrast to that classic American style.
Florals and flowy skirts, crochet tops, and long hair.
Listen to different music.
And the influence of the Beatles.
Use substances. I don't know if we can stay in the school performance.
This was also an impact of the Beatles that we felt we just couldn't ignore.
They're not responsible, in a sense, for those mind-altering substances.
It didn't glorify them or anything, but they certainly used them to create some very different and interesting music that I think, in a sense, influenced other people to do said substances.
Specifically, the hippies latched on to doing said substances.
And that's something that they'll always be remembered for, and we will always associate with that subculture, generation, and time period. Okay, so real quick, before we end this show off, I did want to say
We know that the Rolling Stones happened.
we just chose to focus on the Beatles and touch a bit on the Who for the sake of this project.
Okay, we want to have a good, solid conclusion in this piece. So I think it'd be interesting if we spoke about how we feel they have still impacted and influenced our culture today.
I feel that everyone knows at least one Beatles song. Even if you think you don't, you do.
Or at the very least, you know who they are, as well as the Who. A lot of people know their music as well.
I mean, I know that we personally both have very strong connections to the Beatles, performing their songs in elementary school chorus, and I personally grew up on their music.
And still today, we get many acts coming from overseas and many different influences of music. And while you can blame that on the internet and our ability to access other cultures and their music,
it was truly the Beatles that started this bridge between the two cultures and the two cultures' music.
I mean, now we have so many British acts and other, countries as well.
I mean, most of my favorite bands and artists, whether they be from this time or another, is from overseas.
So to sum up the piece we just performed for you,
The Beatles.
The Who,
and many other acts that we didn't touch on due to time constraint,
crossed a social and cultural frontier, bridging the gaps between American and British culture as well as music.
And on a more global scale, the Beatles impacted how we perceive music and art today,
How we view rock and roll,
the overall impact of the Beatles and other bands involved in the so-called British invasion,
change the way we see music and culture and art forever.
Thank you.